Coming to you from 4,200 feet in the hills of Oregon, it's the voice of Chi-Town, the reddest beard in the high desert, your host of the MOA broadcast, Sam Wilson. All right, folks, we got a great show lined up today. Don't forget, if you have any questions or concerns, comments, you'd like to leave some feedback, or even give us some ideas for a show, don't hesitate to send us an email to info@gearconvoy.com. That's info@gearconvoy.com. We pick out the best email each week and send out a free mini survival kit to the best comment, question, whatever else. And that applies also for our a larger podcast, the hour-long version that we do that's more focused on survival and all, dealing with all the wild stuff that goes on in the world. So there's also a little bit of news and commentary and so forth. That being said, you can get all that info at www.gearconvoy.com. Click on the MOA broadcast tab. And you can also check out all the other fun stuff we have on the website, from survival gear to U.S.-made gear and knives and so forth. Okay, we've been kind of focusing on the Italian mafia for the last several episodes, so today we're going to kind of switch it up a little bit and go down a different path. We're going to look into, possibly for this episode definitely, and possibly for the next couple of episodes, we'll look at the Irish mafia, a very different brand of mafia and organized crime, but in the end, they all have the same basic goal, and they just have slightly different methods in carrying it out. So let's go ahead and jump on in. I like to always remind everybody, we do the first couple of minutes here, kind of just extemporizing, much like the regular MOA broadcast, not the true crime one. But then we switch to a manuscript style. That way it helps us stay on point and not forget anything, and also kind of get focused and get through everything in a reasonable amount of time. But as a reminder, don't forget, we do a lot of research on all these episodes, and specifically the true crime episode. But you got to remember, there is so much information out there, and many of these things took place 30, 40, 50 or more years ago. In many instances, there are varying accounts of what happened, and sometimes conflicting reports. We do a lot of research. We don't just go off of Wikipedia or whatever else. We do a lot of research and try and get actual legal sources whenever we can. But sometimes you got to kind of pick a path and go with it. So if you find conflicting information or something you'd like us to correct, feel free, again, send us an email, info@gearconvoy.com. And from there, we're going to go ahead and jump on in to today's episode of MOA True Crime. Jimmy Coonan, the butcher of Hell's Kitchen. In the grim shadows of Manhattan's West Side, where narrow alleys met the smoke of dying factories and dockside bars hummed with danger, one name struck fear and awe into all who dared whisper it: Jimmy Coonan. As the charismatic yet terrifying leader of the Westies, a gang of Irish-American criminals based in Hell's Kitchen, Coonan etched his name into New York's criminal lore with a brutality unmatched by even his mafia counterparts. From humble beginnings and a childhood defined by violence, to an adulthood bathed in blood and alliances with the Italian mafia, Coonan's life is a chilling study of loyalty, savagery, and the corruption of power. Now we examine the story of Jimmy Coonan, not just the man, but the world he built and destroyed. Origins in Blood. James Jimmy Coonan was born December 21, 1946, in Hell's Kitchen, a working-class neighborhood on the west side of Manhattan. The son of a bookkeeper, Jimmy grew up surrounded by poverty, ethnic tensions, and a simmering undercurrent of violence. In the 1950s and 60s, Hell's Kitchen was a battleground of Irish, Italian, and Puerto Rican gangs, a place where young boys grew up fast, or didn't grow up at all. Legend has it that Coonan's early hatred of Mickey Spillane, the Irish mob boss of Hell's Kitchen at the time, was born the day Spillane allegedly beat his father during a dispute. Reportedly, when Coonan was a young man, his father John was kidnapped, pistol-whipped, and severely beaten by Spillane, a well-known mobster who frequently employed the kidnap-for-ransom racket of local merchants to their families. Whether or not this tale is fully true, it represents the emotional kernel that would define Coonan's life: revenge, power, and defiance of authority. As a teenager, Jimmy got involved in petty thefts and barroom brawls, quickly gaining a reputation for a quick temper and a willingness to use violence to get what he wanted. Rise of a street soldier. By the late 60s, Coonan was moving from street-level crime into more serious rackets. He ran with tough Irish crews, learned the ropes of extortion, loan sharking, and hijacking, and began carving out a name for himself. According to conflicting reports which have been difficult to corroborate, one of his earliest known run-ins with law enforcement may have been a botched kidnapping attempt in 1966, in which Coonan tried to snatch a loan shark, possibly to hold for ransom. The plan went sideways, and Coonan was arrested and sentenced to prison. But even incarceration didn't slow his rise. While inside, he built connections and reinforced his reputation as someone not to be trifled with. Upon his release in the early 70s, Jimmy returned to Hell's Kitchen with sharper instincts and a burning ambition: to take down Mickey Spillane and become the undisputed boss of the West Side. Spillane had ruled Hell's Kitchen for years, running a relatively conservative operation. He avoided drugs, maintained a truce with the Italian mafia, and kept violence to a minimum. But Coonan didn't believe in half measures. He saw drugs, guns, and bloodshed as the price and privilege of power. The War for Hell's Kitchen. The conflict between Jimmy Coonan and Mickey Spillane erupted into a full-blown gang war in the mid-70s. Spillane had a loyal base, but Coonan was younger, more ruthless, and had a newer breed of enforcers at his side. Among them was Francis Mickey Featherstone, a paranoid, hot-headed Vietnam veteran with a hair-triggered temper and a taste for blood. The duo, backed by an increasingly vicious crew, began a campaign of assassinations, ambushes, and strategic intimidation aimed at dismantling Spillane's empire. Bodies started piling up. Rivals were gunned down in bars and on street corners. Informants were tortured, killed, and sometimes dismembered, a grisly tactic designed to send a message to anyone considering betrayal. The Westies quickly became known not just for their efficiency, but for their brutality. On May 13, 1977, the war for Hell's Kitchen came to an abrupt and violent end. Roy DeMeo, one of the most prolific killers in mafia history and head of the DeMeo crew, was deeply tied to Paul Castellano, the Gambino boss at the time. DeMeo specialized in making people disappear, literally, through dismemberment and disposal, also known as the Gemini method, and was often deployed for sensitive or high-priority murders. The turf war was settled quickly and definitively. Spillane was waiting outside his girlfriend's apartment in Woodside, Queens, when he was shot once in the head. The hit was quick, silent, and professional, a textbook mob execution. He was 47 years old. There were no witnesses, no immediate suspects, and the case quickly went cold. The NYPD and FBI immediately suspected a mafia hit, but no one was charged. According to some accounts and speculation within law enforcement circles and mob biographies, DeMeo may have carried out or arranged Spillane's murder as a favor to Coonan, thereby eliminating a long-standing obstacle to both Gambino expansion and Coonan's ambitions of running Hell's Kitchen. Crowned in blood, the Westies take over. With Mickey Spillane out of the picture, Coonan emerged as the new kingpin of Hell's Kitchen. But this was not a quiet transition of power. It was a reign inaugurated with blood. The Westies, Coonan's hand-picked crew of enforcers, killers, and streetwise gangsters, had gained a reputation so fearsome that their name alone struck fear in people on both sides of the law. They weren't just violent, they were theatrical about it. Dismembered bodies were found in garbage bags on the sidewalks, torsos bobbed up in the Hudson River, and whispers of torture chambers haunted the alleys behind 10th Avenue. For the residents of Hell's Kitchen, it was as if the neighborhood had fallen under the rule of a rogue militia. Early on in their grisly reign of terror, the Westies decided to settle up on a rather large debt held by Jewish loan shark Ruby Stein. Stein was a powerful and feared loan shark in Manhattan during the 1960s and 70s. He operated mainly out of the Garment District in Midtown and was known for his extensive lending operation, particularly among gamblers, bookies, and small-time crooks who couldn't borrow from banks. Ruby Stein was not a mobster in the traditional sense. He wasn't a made man, but he operated under the protection of the Genovese crime family, which gave him both legitimacy and security in the treacherous world of street hustlers and professional criminals. He was in his 60s at the time of his death and was seen as a quiet operator with a huge amount of cash in circulation. Since Coonan and his Westies were trying to prove themselves to the Gambino family, led at the time by Paul Castellano, this was a golden opportunity. Take out a major player like Stein, seize his assets, and show they were capable of big-league violence and racketeering. Coonan lured Stein to the Times Square Hotel under the pretense of a business meeting. Stein, unaware he was walking into a trap, was ambushed by Coonan and his crew, which included Mickey Featherstone and Eddie the Butcher Comiskey. He was shot in the head almost immediately upon arrival. Stein's body was then dismembered in a bathtub, a gruesome Westies trademark. The remains were packed into garbage bags and dumped into the East River. According to reports, a member of the Westies forgot to deflate the lungs before throwing the torso in, and Stein's torso washed up on shore and was found a few days later. But only parts of his body were recovered, making it hard for police to piece together the full story. The alliance with the Gambino family. Coonan, unlike many Irish mob leaders before him, was forward-thinking in his brutality. He didn't just kill to eliminate threats. He killed to build street cred. He knew fear was currency, and he spent it lavishly. But his most strategic move was also his most dangerous. He courted the Italian mafia. Coonan understood that to truly thrive in the cutthroat jungle of New York organized crime, he would need protection and opportunity. The Italians, specifically the Gambino crime family, at the time run by Paul Castellano and his powerful underboss Agnello Della Croce, were the ruling class of the underworld. For decades, they had regarded the Irish as unruly, unreliable street thugs. Coonan intended to change that perception. He brokered a deal. In exchange for carrying out hits and working jobs for the Gambinos, the Westies would receive mafia backing and a slice of the city's wider criminal enterprises. Della Croce, known for his old-school mafia ethics, saw promise in Coonan and agreed. It was a historic pact, one that elevated Coonan's power beyond Hell's Kitchen and made the Westies an official extension of La Cosa Nostra's killing arm. The alliance also brought new sources of income: control over union jobs at the piers, construction rackets, labor extortion, gambling dens, and drug trafficking. The Westies practically became millionaires overnight, but wealth only sharpened their appetite for destruction. Murder as business, dismemberment as intimidation. To truly understand the terror of the Westies under Coonan, one must understand how they treated murder not just as necessity, but as performance. It wasn't enough to kill someone. The method had to send a message. The Westies were among the few Irish gangs to adopt mafia-style dismemberment as a regular tactic. They studied it. They refined it. They embraced it. And most of all, they seemed to enjoy it. Victims were sometimes taken to a butcher shop owned by a Westie associate, where they were dismembered with meat saws. Others were chopped up in apartments, their remains stuffed into bags and boxes and dumped into the river. Sometimes, parts were scattered in different burrows to complicate identification. This wasn't just for efficiency, it was psychological warfare. Among the most chilling murders attributed to Coonan's orders, Vincent Governaro was a small-time gangster and associate on the periphery of Hell's Kitchen's underworld. While not a central figure in the Irish mob or the mafia, Governaro made a deadly mistake. He insulted or crossed someone within the Westies, likely Jimmy Coonan or one of his close enforcers. In the world of the Westies, disrespect was treated as a capital offense. Action was taken, swiftly and with a frightening level of savagery. Governaro was lured to a location, possibly under the guise of a meeting or drink. Once captured, he was beaten, tortured, and murdered. Details from FBI informants and witnesses claim Governaro was tied up and tortured before being killed. To inflict maximum damage both on the victim and those who heard about it, he was brutalized with a baseball bat all over his body. Then, his fingers and ears were cut off, possibly while he was still alive. Finally, his body was dismembered, and some parts, including his head, were never recovered. What remained of his torso was dumped, likely into the Hudson River or left in a remote location to rot. Eddie the Butcher Comiskey, once a trusted member of the crew, was killed after a power dispute. He was lured to a party, shot in the head, and dismembered in a bathtub. His body parts were weighted and dumped into the East River. Dominic Baldy Dom Martirano, an Italian associate, disappeared after a disagreement. Though never proven, insiders believe Coonan had him killed and disposed of in the same fashion. Coonan's inner circle enforced absolute silence and obedience. Disloyalty was a death sentence. But cracks were beginning to form. Power, paranoia, and the turning tide. For all his outward confidence and commanding presence, Jimmy Coonan lived under a veil of growing paranoia. Power in the criminal underworld is never truly secure, and the more the Westies expanded their influence, the more internal instability threatened to collapse everything he had built. By the early 1980s, the Westies had transformed from a scrappy gang into a ruthless syndicate. They controlled loan sharking operations that bled entire neighborhoods dry, skimmed profits from the local unions, and ran illegal gambling operations stretching from the piers of Manhattan to the bars of Queens. They operated extortion rackets targeting construction firms, trucking companies, and nightclubs. For a time, it seemed they were untouchable. But inside the gang, loyalty was beginning to fray. The madness of Mickey Featherstone. Francis Mickey Featherstone, Coonan's volatile right-hand man, had always been a time bomb. A diagnosed schizophrenic with a hair-triggered temper, Featherstone often acted without warning, flying into rages or descending into silent paranoia. His war record from Vietnam gave him a dark mystique, and his willingness to kill made him indispensable. But Coonan knew that Featherstone was also unpredictable and increasingly unstable. One of the most telling signs of dysfunction came with the murder of Harold Whitehead, a friend of Featherstone's who had apparently been talking too much about the gang's activities. Featherstone allegedly shot him in the head and left the body in the basement bathroom of a bar. The murder was poorly thought out, and more importantly, it was sloppy. It drew attention. Not long after, Featherstone was arrested and charged with murder. During his trial, prosecutors introduced evidence of the Westies' involvement in numerous killings. Featherstone's mental state and his refusal to follow orders increasingly put pressure on Coonan, who was worried that his second-in-command might one day flip. That day would come sooner than expected. Featherstone's paranoia deepened when he realized that Coonan and the crew had set him up. In a calculated move to protect himself and preserve the gang, Coonan allegedly framed Featherstone for a murder he didn't commit: the killing of a bartender named Michael Holly, whom the Westies believed was a potential informant. Featherstone was convicted and sentenced to 25 years, but the case against him began to unravel. When he discovered evidence of the frame-up, something inside him snapped. Facing life in prison and betrayal by his closest ally, Featherstone did the unthinkable for a gangster of his stature. He turned government informant. His cooperation with the FBI marked the beginning of the end for Jimmy Coonan and the Westies. Collapse, trial, and the fall of Jimmy Coonan. When Mickey Featherstone agreed to cooperate with federal authorities in 1986, it sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. Featherstone wasn't just a minor player. He was the heart of the Westies' enforcement arm, Coonan's most trusted lieutenant, and a man with an encyclopedic knowledge of the gang's darkest deeds. He knew where the bodies were buried, quite literally, and now he was willing to talk. Federal agents were already building a RICO, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, case against the Westies. They had informants, wiretaps, and years of investigative legwork, but Featherstone's testimony was the missing cornerstone. With his help, prosecutors could finally lay bare the inner workings of one of New York's most violent gangs. Featherstone began to recount the Westies' bloody history: the murders, the dismemberments, the extortions, the deals with the Gambinos, and even internal betrayals. His testimony painted a vivid, chilling picture of Jimmy Coonan as a man who ruled through charisma and carnage, who ordered murders as casually as ordering dinner. The indictment and the end of an empire. In 1986, Coonan and several key members of the Westies were indicted on a sweeping set of charges that included racketeering, extortion, illegal gambling, and at least 7 murders. The trial became a media sensation. In a city already captivated by the mafia's golden age, the Irish mob's unraveling was front-page news. Coonan, ever the calculating leader, tried to present himself in court as a family man, a misunderstood businessman, a victim of overzealous law enforcement. But the evidence, and especially Featherstone's testimony, told another story. Jurors heard about how victims were lured to meetings, killed, chopped up, and discarded like garbage. They saw photographs of crime scenes and heard tales of blood-soaked bathtubs and industrial meat saws. In 1988, Jimmy Coonan was convicted on multiple counts of racketeering and other charges. He was sentenced to 75 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. As far as the justice system was concerned, he would never walk free again. The fall of the Westies. With Coonan behind bars and Featherstone in witness protection, the Westies collapsed almost overnight. The remaining members scattered or picked off by law enforcement. Without their leader, they were just another gang with too many enemies and no organization. Hell's Kitchen itself began to change. The docks were no longer controlled by mobbed-up unions. Gentrification crept in. Old Irish bars were replaced by high-rise condos and coffee shops. The neighborhood that once trembled under Coonan's shadow slowly shed its violent past. The prison years. After his conviction, Coonan was sent to a high-security federal prison. Now well into his 70s, he has faded from public view. He has been repeatedly denied parole and is unlikely to ever be released. By all accounts, he has lived a quiet, uneventful prison life, a stark contrast to the chaos he once orchestrated on the streets of New York. But even behind bars, Coonan's legacy continues to cast a long shadow. His story is a cautionary tale, a case study in the evolution of street gangs into structured, mafia-style organizations, and how those structures inevitably break down under their own violence and mistrust. Conclusion: The Ghosts of Hell's Kitchen. Jimmy Coonan's story is a bloody and violent tale of woe. It is the story of a boy born into a world of poverty and violence, who climbed to power not by transcending that world, but by becoming its most terrifying product. He was, in many ways, the last of the Irish mafia rulers, a man who tried to stand toe-to-toe with La Cosa Nostra and succeeded, if only briefly. But in the end, all that remains of Jimmy Coonan are stories, many of them drenched in blood, some in admiration, most in fear. His reign is over, his gang scattered or dead, and the neighborhood he once ruled has transformed beyond recognition. But for those who lived through the Westies' heyday, the memories remain vivid, a flowing river of blood and dismembered bodies from all those who didn't make it out alive. All right, folks, that's going to do it for today's episode. Man, the Irish Mafia is just as bad as the Italian Mafia, right? Certainly something you don't want to be involved in. Man, what a mess. Okay, we're going to wrap it up there. Don't forget, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, whatever, feel free to shoot us an email, info@gearconvoy.com, and feel free to check out the www.gearconvoy.com website, all kinds of good info there about the MOA broadcast and other things. So that's going to do it for us. Thanks for joining us again. And remember, folks, if you wait to prepare, it may be too late. If you don't make it out alive, you don't make it out at all. Stay safe out there, folks.